Good afternoon and welcome to Capital Account. I'm Lauren Lister here in Washington, D.C. Here are your headlines for Thursday, February 9th. Italian Prime Minister, technocrat Mario Monti has been in Washington meeting with Barack Obama today. Meanwhile, Greek leaders scraped together a deal on austerity, but they may face the same problem, arguing about this again 3 months from now. Fractures in the EU continue to appear as leaders try to keep it together. But does any of this matter, or does the likelihood of a European disintegration have to do with something else entirely? We'll explain. And is the same thing that moves markets what moves women's hemlines? Is the same thing driving the Dow what drives Hollywood producers to make movies like this?
They're gonna catch up with us. They're gonna catch up with us, and they're going to kill us.
And forget jobs or the eurozone crisis. Is the Dow really the best indicator of who will be U.S. president? We'll hear from Robert Prechter. He's founder of Elliott Wave International. And states and federal officials have finally reached that foreclosure deal, a $25 billion settlement with the 5 biggest banks guilty of abusive practices like robo-signing signed on. Now, its billed as helping homeowners, but Nomi Prince says this is yet another example of only good for the banks. You'll hear why. Let's get to today's Capital Account. So as we watch the eurozone debt crisis and look to what politicians or technocrats are doing to keep Europe together, or as we watch the 2012 U.S. presidential election campaign and look at what candidates are saying, or as we try to analyze what the economy and economic news means about where the stock market is headed, one of the outcome of events like this has to do with something else entirely. The same thing that dictates hemlines. You heard me right. Seen rising here in the early 60s.
You gotta feel it here. Yeah! Are you gonna be sincere? Are you gonna be sincere? Yeah!
So you can see a little shin, but skirts got higher as the decade went on, as you can see there. What if the deeper thing moving all of these trends, skirts, markets, events, is social mood, measured best by the stock market? That is just the theory behind the work of Robert Prechter. He's founder of Elliott Wave International and author of this book, Conquer the Crash. You can survive and prosper in a deflationary depression. I spoke to him earlier, and for viewers who may not be familiar with Elliott Wave theory, I asked him first to break down why he believes social mood is the driver of all of these things.
Well, it's not an intuitive way to look at things. Most people sort of default to a mechanical way of believing that causality works in society. It's the primitive way that we learned how to cope with things. If a ball is rolling down a hill or a stone is rolling down a hill, it could crush you. You know that it isn't going to change direction on its own volition, so you can jump out of the way. Most people feel society changes in the same way. It's going to go in one direction unless something impacts it. What I was troubled by with this explanation is the idea that these impacts seem to come from nowhere under that idea. In other words, what causes the actions in the first place? And when I started studying the stock market and different social actions such as the growth or contraction in the economy or the kind of music that people listen to, those sorts of cultural things, I found that they tended to ebb and flow together. So I began to realize that there's something else going on, and I think what's happening is that there are endogenously regulated waves of social mood that arise naturally among human beings when they're in a social setting, and that rather than the events of society determining the general mood of the population, I think it's the general mood that actually dictates the character of the actions that people take in a social setting. So it's a completely different way of looking at things. And as you said at the outset, it extends the stock market, the way the macroeconomy is going, a lot of political trends, and the more frivolous things such as popular music trends and movies and so on.
And it's completely fascinating. How do you measure it, though, using Elliott Wave?
Well, unfortunately, we cannot put electrodes in everyone's brains. That would be very nice if we could measure it directly. What I've noticed is the most sensitive measure of social mood, at least that I can find, and also the one where we have excellent back data. In fact, going back 200 years in this country and another 100 years in Britain is the stock market. And I think there's another reason that the stock market is so good at reflecting social mood, and that is that people can react very, very quickly to changes in their mood. They can buy and sell stocks these days with a push of a button, certainly with no more than a few hours contemplation or maybe calling a broker. Whereas some of the other things that may result from a change in social mood, such as a change in business conditions, take time to effect. So if someone decides it's time to expand my business, he may have to go out and borrow money or rent more space, hire new people, and that takes a few months. And guess what? That's why recessions follow downturns in the stock market and recoveries follow upturns in the stock market. They do not lead them. I think it's because of this delay in expressing social mood.
And it's so interesting that with social mood putting pressure on all of these different things, some that you named, that the barometer for that is the markets. I want to go into some of these examples, though, putting markets aside. Let's look at some of the cultural examples. Everyone may remember Goldie Hawn and Laugh-In in the 60s. I want to play a clip of that for the audience.
Sure.
Help me! Help me!
My mommy told me never to talk to strangers. How come you're so sure?
Okay, so this was the late 60s. She's wearing a little short skirt. I say this is driven between a combination of nice legs and maybe women's liberation movements that were gaining steam. You say this is the bull market. Explain why.
Well, I wasn't the first one to come up with that idea. That's been around since the 20s, but I think socioeconomic theory explains why there's truth to the idea. When the mood has been swinging positively for a number of decades, people reach a feeling of euphoria, in essence, and they express it in many different ways. Overvaluing stocks is one way that people do it, and people dress with more color, a lot more colorful things, such as in the mid-60s. They also dress a lot women dress with less clothing, let's say. So in the mid-60s, you had bikinis were the big thing. I mean, they were making headlines. It was so daring, you know. And as you say, short skirts in the late 60s. They certainly returned in the late 90s. If you watch any of the MTV videos by women, you know, they were barely dressed for most of those. And when times are more difficult, and I don't just mean the economy, but when mood is depressed, you find maxi skirts, for example, in the 70s coming along. Also, we've looked into colors. We find that grays, browns, and blacks are more popular during bear market periods or depressed periods. So there are so many different things we've looked at. We've looked at car colors. We've looked at the popularity of James Bond movies. All these things seem to ebb and flow with the very same thing, which is the stock market. But I'll add one more thing.
Yeah.
New studies by others are beginning to confirm this observation. You probably heard about the Twitter studies that Bolin and Mao did.
I have, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, they're terrific because they found that the change in mood that they detected in the Twitter messages actually preceded changes in the stock market by a couple of days, and that's exactly what socioeconomic theory says they should find.
It's totally fascinating. And just what you said about maxi skirts, it's interesting because those have actually come back in style in the last few years, and we know what the economy and stock market has been doing. And behind me, I just have a Life magazine that shows the hemlines rising. It's from 1970. So interesting cultural stuff there. But let's get back to the markets, because there's this concept that we really see in the mainstream news that news drives markets. And I want to just give a couple examples. Our audience is familiar, but just let's bring up some headlines so that they can see. So this one says U.S. stocks advance as Greek leaders agree. And then, you know, one from a couple weeks ago says stocks drop with euro on Greece concern. Dimitri wants to jump in here for a question.
Hey, Robert. Yeah, so this is something that we often poke fun at a lot on the show, which is that in the morning, the news will be saying that the markets are rising due to XYZ, and then the same thing will be attributed to a fall in the market a few hours later. In your experience looking at this over decades, what is the connection that you see between stock market movements and the news cycle?
What you just pointed out, we've seen many times. In fact, sometimes the news is precisely the same, and they just attribute investors' reaction to the different direction. Well, part of socioeconomic theory is that people are not reasoning so much when they're making their investment decisions, which is the opposite of the efficient market hypothesis. What they're actually doing is rationalizing. And it's very easy at the end of a stock market day, when you already know which direction the market has gone, to attribute it to this news event or that news event. But if someone only had the news in the paper, nothing about the particular market they were after, but they knew exactly where commodity prices were going, they knew exactly what would happen in Greece and so on, they would not be able to predict what the stock market did that day already. So they're fitting the news to the market, and anyone can do that. It's rationalizing. And I'd like to add one more thing. Your show is unique because instead of generating those very headlines, you're analyzing them. I think that's terrific.
Aw, thank you. I really appreciate that. Let's talk about, let's keep talking about the markets. Let's talk about the Dow and what it's done recently, because we've seen it hit its highest point since 2008. I guess on the surface, things are better since 2008, but there's still a lot of problems. I mean, we have long-term structural unemployment. We have more officials coming out today saying Europe's in recession. There are a lot of reasons to be pessimistic. So what explains the Dow right now?
Well, first of all, under the model that I use to try to predict the stock market, at least in a probabilistic way, the Elliott wave model, we completed a form, 5 waves down, in March of 2009. And I turned very bullish at the time, went on television, I said this is the kind of bottom that should lead to a substantial rally, where there were only 2% bulls among futures traders in the S&P, as reported by tradefutures.com. And those are the kind of things we want to see. We want to be on one side. We said it's going to be a big rally, and by the time it's over, the economy will be in recovery because, again, as we said earlier, the economy lags the stock market. People will be optimistic again because that's what's driving the move, a change toward more optimism. We'll also see the Fed taking credit for saving the financial world, and they've done that. So all the things we expected to see, we're seeing. But at this moment, we're also seeing extremes in mood, and positive mood. And this is the third time in the last dozen years that we've seen it. The first time was 2000, the second time 2007, and again, basically now. Things can stretch further, but we're definitely seeing readings among individual investors, economists, money managers, and all subgroups, including futures traders and options traders. All of them are on the extreme side of optimism. Now, that doesn't mean the market has to peak, next week, but it means it's much closer to a high than a low. So we're expecting that the things that reflect social mood have since followed the rally. That's normal. If the market turns down again, they'll follow the market on the way down as well.
Interesting. And just more broadly, I want to play a commercial because you're talking about some more optimism. Let's look at it broader in society. Let's play that Super Bowl commercial that people have been obsessing over.
This country can't be knocked out with one punch. We get right back up again, and when we do, the world's going to hear the roar of our engines. Yeah, it's halftime, America, and our second half's about to begin.
So emotional Clint Eastwood in that car commercial. What does that signify about where society is in the mood?
Well, I'm not sure it signifies per se. You can overdo this, and I don't want to sort of come on like a sociologist where they can find meaning in every little event. We want to look at things that we can quantify. So while that's a lot of fun, and I love Clint Eastwood and so on, you can tell that it's not 1999, because in 1999 everything was great. The central bankers were on the cover of Time magazine. Everything was under control. They told us it was a new economy. The Fed said we've controlled interest rates and the money supply so perfectly that we have a Goldilocks situation, too hot, not too cold. Everybody thought things were great, so there'd be no need for that kind of advertisement. But now that things have been shifting for the last 12 years and people can feel it, especially on Main Street, I think you're now getting people, saying, hey, let's pay attention. Let's try to recover from this. But again, those things are, in terms of, yes, we can pull ourselves up. You really can't change the waves of social mood. You can only observe them. And as an individual, you can either get on board if it's on the upside or get out of the way if it's on the downside.
And as they say in psychology, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, which could explain that commercial in the view of Robert Prechter, author and founder of Elliott Wave International. And still ahead, find out if the stock market will predict the 2012 presidential election. We'll tell you what history says, but first, your closing market numbers.
Welcome to the future.
Science, technology, innovation, all the latest developments from around Russia.
We've got the future covered.
Wealthy British scion Zach Wilson, investment activist
Markets, finance, scandal. Find out what's really happening to the global economy in Kaiser Report on RT.
Welcome back. Sticking on this really interesting subject, in the U.S. in the 70s, we saw a horrific stagflationary depression. Now, we also saw large-scale horror in a different way, movies.
Settling out here, something. Stop! Stop!
This is the movie that is just as real.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre, recession, not unrelated factors, according to Robert Prechter, founder of Elliott Wave International, author of this book, Conquer the Crash, You Can Survive and Prosper in a Deflationary Depression. So we continued speaking. We looked at what Prechter believes wave theory means for movies and markets post-2008 financial crisis today. There's a movie that came out in 2009, right after the bottom, shortly after the bottom of the market. I want to play a trailer.
They're going to catch up with us. They're going to catch up with us, and they're going to kill us.
So this movie was The Road. It was apocalyptic. The cut line you saw across the screen said the end of civilization. Are we going to see more of this kind of thing, or worse than this kind of thing? Because in our view, it really doesn't seem like we've seen the kind of Texas Chainsaw Massacre flood of horror movies that we saw in the 70s. And according to your theory, that was during a fourth wave down in a larger bull market. So should it be far worse now?
Well, I think in the first part of the bear market it was. In fact, I wrote my book, The Wave Principle of Human Social Behavior in 1999, and I included this chart showing the horror movies of the 30s, and they all bunched in a very short period of time while the stock market was collapsing from 1930 to 1932/33. All the big names came in then. And the same thing happened in the 70s, as you pointed out, the zombie movies, the slasher movies, and so on. All of them were in the 70s or late 60s down to the bottom in the 70s. All of it was bear market territory. As soon as the market turned down in 2000, we started getting a slew of horror movies again, and a whole new genre was born, torture movies, which, unbelievable new thing that grossed people out. They were very intense. The Saw series was one of them, the Hostel films. So I think they've already broken new ground, just as the 70s did and just as the 30s did. But to answer your second question, absolutely, if the market has another leg down, and I think the odds of that are very high based on my interpretation of the Elliott Wave model and these sentiment figures we've been talking about, then you're going to see, I think, horror movies break ground that people haven't even thought of yet. Who knows? There may be X-rated horror movies. It could be quite a scene. So if that's not your thing, stay away from those kind of movies in the future. They're going to be very intense. I guess you've heard about the one, I think it's called Centipede.
Oh, gosh.
Some people said it was so disgusting they couldn't even watch it. So
yeah.
We've seen some already.
Okay, so that's your prediction for markets and for movies. Let's talk about the economies. Let's talk about the eurozone crisis. Because every day there's something new going on and a prediction about whether the eurozone is going to stay together or not. Everybody trying to read the tea leaves. You predicted this kind of turmoil and disintegration long before any of this. Back in 1998, 4 years before the euro was even in circulation. What did you see that everybody else missed?
All right. Most people, as you say, they're looking at tea leaves because they're seeing every one of these events as a cause. That's the problem. That's the traditional way of looking at it and say, okay, here's a new event. What's it going to cause? When we looked at it way back in 1998 to about 2002, when they were forming the European Union, was that it was a result. The market had been going up ever since 1974. really since 1932. All these waves were piling onto each other at a major top. We saw the lowest valuation of stocks, the greatest debt buildup, all these reflections of positive social mood. And here were these countries that have been fighting each other for 1,000 years, deciding they were going to form a union. We said, this is not a cause of something, this is the result. And because it's happening at a peak in social mood, unlike, say, the American Revolution, which occurred at a major, major low in social mood after 64 years of bear market in Britain, this is occurring at a major top. It's not going to last, and when the trend turns down toward a more negative social mood, we will begin to see dissension and fracturing in the ranks, and that's exactly what we've been seeing. And since there's more bear market to go, I think the odds are probably that ultimately the EU will not hold together.
It's so fascinating. And then some of the trends that we're seeing right now as a result of the pessimism we're in work out in your theory too. For example, the fractures we see between Germans and Greeks with the emergence of old divides, right?
Well, that's certainly part of the dissension that we were talking about. Mm-hmm. And we really think it's in the early stages. I think by the time it's over, you're going to see people say, we're afraid this was a mistake. But, the main thing I want to say is not so much whether that particular kind of forecast comes true or not. It's that the trend will be in the direction of social mood. If the stock market just keeps going up year after year after year, and I'm wrong on that particular forecast, then you'll see things begin to heal. Mm-hmm. I mean, in the bottom in 2002/3, suddenly the United States went to war. And that happened 1 week after the low in 2003. And after a couple of years of recovery, there was peace in Iraq and that sort of thing. So that's what's determining the outcomes, however the stock market decides to go.
So based on what we know now and what you know about wave theory, what do you think is going to happen with the 2012 presidential election?
It's really social mood that's guiding the voter who's on the fringe. Some people vote always the same way, some vote philosophically, but the swing voters are voting by social mood. And we tested it, we went back not just 50 years like a lot of these studies, we went all the way back to the 1700s, the very first presidential election with 200 years worth of history. And we found that the stock market is a reliable predictor of whether or not an incumbent president running for re-election gets elected. Very high significance. GDP had far lesser significance. Unemployment and inflation, as far back as the data go, have no significance at all. So we think we proved a bit of a point.
So maybe Republicans should hope that the Dow plunges and crashes. But anyway, you can read his study that he's come out with on social mood and elections at the Social Science Research Network. Also interesting, I asked him, what is the differentiation we see, just the rising inequality, the divide between maybe the mood on Wall Street and on Main Street? What does that have to do with social mood? He says they saw the same cross currents during the 70s. It ends up coming together and ending up in one big leg down, in his words, at the end of the day. All right, before we go, a reality check. So the U.S. foreclosure deal that we were talking about earlier this week, too, it's been going on for a long time, though. It's finally been reached between state and federal officials with the 5 biggest banks that were guilty of foreclosure abuses, okay? Things like robo-signing of documents that we've seen since the housing crash in 2008. Now, this deal came after 16 months they've been working on the thing, and it's billed as help for homeowners. Now, here's how U.S. President Barack Obama was touting it in a speech today.
We have reached a landmark settlement with the nation's largest banks that will speed relief to the hardest hit homeowners and some of the most abusive practices of the mortgage industry, and begin to turn the page on an era of recklessness that has left so much damage in its wake.
Okay, yeah, it sounds good. Let's see what's in the actual deal. So there's about $17 billion in it to pay for mortgage debt forgiveness, $3 billion for refinancing. Now, the banks are in the driver's seat in this money, and there's $750 billion in negative home equity out there, reportedly. Now, This is another one of those things, too, where if you're watching this show for sure, you're sitting there, you're sitting back, and you're going, okay, who is this deal really good for? Struggling homeowners or the banks who are settling on all of this fraud? Well, I want to remind you what Nomi Prince, author, former Goldman Sachs managing director, who's been following this closely, said about who this deal benefits on our show earlier this week.
As usual, it would be a good deal for banks in the disguise of being good for homeowners. The banks would be in the power seat of deciding how they use their portion of that $17 billion to do their job, which is to work with customers to refinance or restructure their debt, which is something that the government did with the banks when it provided them all these subsidies and bailouts a few years ago, but which wasn't carried over into the homeowner community, which is why foreclosures have continued to rise, defaults continue to be bad, and the housing market continues to be anemic.
Now, Nomi Prince says that nothing is going to matter until banks mark to market the lousy mortgages that are on their books. As for this deal for banks, of course, this ends a probe of abusive foreclosure practices. So that's good news for them. I wish I could tell you whether or not banks robo-signed the agreement. That I don't know. But will they suffer? That's, of course, a big question. Well, one example I have, J.P. Morgan, according to Bloomberg, won't even need to set aside additional costs to cover its share in the agreement. So if that's any indication, doesn't sound like they're going to be suffering too bad as a result of signing on to this settlement. And I recommend you check out our full interview with Nomi Prince. It's on our website from earlier this week. More on that deal and lots of interesting stuff that you should definitely go back and check out. But for now, that's our reality check. And that's all we have time for. Thanks so much for tuning in. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Lauren Lister. You can also go to our website and give us feedback on the show at youtube.com/Capital Account. You know we read it. You know we respond to it. If you don't see our producers responding to you on the boards right there, I may respond to you. Tomorrow is viewer feedback day. Also on the show tomorrow, we have Lou Rockwell, chairman of the Von Mises Institute, so you won't want to miss that. But for now, from everyone here at Capital Account, I'm Lauren Lister. Have a great night.